Hello, and welcome everyone to Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation's Day of Remembrance 2021 program. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We've got a great program lined up, and we're looking forward to all of the other Day of Remembrance activities that are coming up. Just to give some special thank yous tonight, I want to thank our partners in this event, Japanese American National Museum, and also the Smithsonian Museum of American History for joining us this evening, and want to thank all of you for coming out. Especially want to send out a thanks to our friends over at Josiah University. Thanks for tuning in from where you are. We are going to bring out our panelists in a few moments. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. We do not have Secretary Norman Mineta with us tonight. Unfortunately, he was a bit under the weather. And so we pulled in a last minute replacement for him in Takashis Story, who I think is going to do a great job for us tonight. And if you do have questions at all, just leave them in the chat right there. So let's go ahead and get going. Can I bring my panelists up? Fantastic. Great to see all of you guys here. There's our last one. So I want to give everyone just an opportunity to introduce themselves just a little bit. We do have a great panel here tonight, a multi-generational panel that's going to bring a lot of perspective to our themes of preserving Japanese American identity and culture. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with our honored guest tonight, Takashi Hoshizaki. Takashi, would you mind telling everyone just a little bit about yourself and your story?
Well, I guess basically I was one of the 63 Heart Mountain draft resistors, and I think also maybe I should point out that when all this started, I was 16 years old, and so didn't know much about the history and so forth. But then as time went on, I suddenly realized what had happened to the Japanese in the United States. And so I guess in that way, I sort of rebelled, and that was basically the basis for my resistance to the draft. And we also use the resistance to the draft, hopefully, as a means of bringing into the court the actual what had happened to us. But unfortunately, in the court itself, they did not permit us to even bring that subject matter up. And so anyway, that's at least a start of where I am. And I am a Nisei and a second generation. And being a Nisei, I was also exposed to a lot of the Japanese. So my Japanese is very weak, and I really can't read the Japanese, but at least I can partially converse in the Japanese. But at my age, if I go to Japan, they sort of laugh at me because I'm speaking in what they call the Meiji Japanese, which is way back. And some of the terms I use, they says, well, we hadn't heard that term in a long time. So anyway, I'll stop with that.
Thanks, Takashi. And we'll definitely be back to you with more questions later. For now, though, I am going to go ahead and switch things over to Shirley and Higuchi. Shirley, would you like to introduce yourself and a little about your story?
Yes, my name is Shirley, and I'm chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. Takashi is actually one of my longstanding board members, and he's also one of the main characters in my book, Setsuko's Secret. He comes in very early on, and I talk about his history, particularly his parents and his family being incarcerated. And in many ways, Takashi is really what we view today as really a civil rights activist, and I'm very honored that I was able to share his story in my book, and I look forward to this panel.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Shirley. Next, I want to go ahead and move on to Clement Hanami, joining us from the Japanese American National Museum. Clement, do you want to talk a little about what you do, who you are, and your story?
Thanks, Dakota. Hi, I'm grateful to be here with such distinguished speakers. Everybody here is so awesome. I'm Clement Hanami. I'm fourth generation Japanese American. My parents, my father was a Kibei Sance, and my mother was a Shin Issei. She was actually a Hibakusha, and my father was uh, basically a farmer in Idaho, and then he moved to Los Angeles. And when the war came, he voluntarily evacuated. Um, so back to Idaho, right next to Minidoka, to Hunt,
Oh,
Idaho. But he also studied Senryu a lot. So, art has always been something in my life. Personally, I'm a visual artist, so I make art. And I also been working at the Japanese American National Museum since 1992, doing mostly exhibitions and programs. And so I guess that's why I'm here.
Fantastic. All right, and next I want to turn things over to Noriko Sanafuji from the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. Noriko, can you tell us a little about what you do at the Smithsonian, but also kind of your experience and your background as well?
So thank you, Dakota and the Heart Mountain Foundation. It's an honor to be joined by esteemed colleagues. And so I work at the National Museum of American History, and specifically to make sure that the Asian Pacific American narrative history is shared at our nation's museum. And I have an honor to be working with many of you across the country about, and specifically this case about Japanese American, preserving the narrative through collections and programs. Personally, I am a Shin Issei, so which means I came after World War II. So I personally do not have a Japanese American incarceration narrative through my family. So I came as a student and sort of found my niche here, and I'm still here. But I've been with the Smithsonian for about 15 years. Not as long as Clement, but I've been enjoying it. It's a fascinating, exciting job that I do to meet with a lot of the people across the country. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Noriko. And finally, I want to turn our attention to our final panelist tonight, which is Erin Aoyama. And Erin, talk a little bit about your story and who you are.
Sure. Thanks, Dakota, for having us here. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with four folks I respect so much and have loved working with. I'm Erin Aoyama. I am a mixed race Yonsei, so I'm fourth generation Japanese American. I grew up in New England, and I'm currently a graduate student in the American Studies Department at Brown University. So I'm really excited to be talking about my family's kind of relationship to Heart Mountain. My grandmother, Misa, and her brother and parents were incarcerated at Heart Mountain, but she never talked about it, as I think is a common experience among a lot of Japanese Americans. So a lot of my learning about what it means to be Japanese American has come through places like Heart Mountain, and all of you folks who've been so important to that process. So I'm really happy to be here and excited for this conversation.
Excellent. So tonight we are jumping into this idea of preserving identity and culture, and coming from the real background of the idea that one of the government's goals within the incarceration was really to kind of eradicate Japanese culture and Japanese American culture in the United States, and yet it has survived and thrived. The Japanese embassy in the United States has supported us for a series of programs to explore not just Japanese culture historically, but Japanese American culture in the present day as well. And so we're very appreciative of their support, and they've really touched on what I think is a fascinating topic for us to explore a little more in depth tonight. And so I'm going to dive into with some questions, just an opening question for all of you, and then I'll kind of single some of you out to talk about your areas of expertise a little later on. But as we were just talking about, historically, you know, the Japanese Americans have been sort of encouraged, you know, officially forced in some ways to make sort of the separation between the Japanese and the American halves of their identity there. And so I wonder for each of you how you have felt that, if you have felt that in your own lives, and how has it affected you? I'll open it up to everyone, but if anybody wants to jump in and kick things off.
Well, I'll kick it off. I mean, I think a lot of it really depends also where you were brought up. I mean, in many ways, I think the Higuchi Saitos is a classic government plan that worked, which was the Higuchis and the Saitos originated from San Jose and LA. They got scattered throughout the United States. And so we were highly assimilated as a family. And it's really interesting because I try to explain this to the Japanese students that I talk to. The culture still is pretty strong and embedded, however. And although I was highly assimilated, I didn't have exposure to other Japanese Americans. Somehow my mother and my grandmother and others really somehow still embedded the Japanese culture in my heart and soul. And it really was through the food. You know, the food, my grandmother used to make fudamaki, different types of sushi, Japanese chicken teriyaki. And for something, you know, genetically, I think for Japanese Americans, you never lose that quest for good Japanese cooking. So that helped me a little bit.
Excellent. So, you know, Shirley, one of the things in your book, Setsuko's Secret, does somebody have a copy they can hold up?
Y'all can.
Perfect. Great. You know, one of the things that you talk about a lot in your new book is this idea of intergenerational trauma, you know, that this is something that, although it affected, you know, Takashi's generation, is something that has carried down in its own way and really shaped Japanese American identity. And I wonder, before we move on to some of the others and their experiences, if you can expand on that just a little bit.
Well, the one thing that I talked about in my book is the Sance effect and multi-generational trauma. And part of that topic came about because being so isolated and insulated in Ann Arbor, Michigan, growing up, I didn't really know there were other Sance daughters like me and that had the same similar history and same type of parenting style that we see in the Japanese American community. And it was really after talking to Daryl Kunatome from LA, who was on my board, that we started trading notes in terms of how our parents were and how they never talked about the incarceration, how there was this unspoken propriety about, you know, how you were supposed to act and be. There was an emphasis on education and achieving, which I definitely, I think, had. So I just think that was sort of my experience in terms of that. And I think there's also an issue like when you grow up knowing that your parents and your grandparents were incarcerated, you know, for 4 years of their lives, and they never really talked about that camp experience. I think what it's done for a lot of Sanseis like me now is to really have this quest for knowledge, you know, a quest for knowledge that I never had growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or going to University of Michigan, or even in law school. So in some ways, it's kind of a new life for me with Heart Mountain. And I find myself very lucky to be part of such a caring community where I feel comfortable being myself.
Well, I'd like to point out that, in fact, I'm still living 3 miles away from Little Tokyo. And so my tie-in with the Japanese community was at a young age to go into Little Tokyo for that Nisei week celebration. And so there's a lot of tie-in there. And Shirley mentioned food. Yes, that is the real tie-in. And in fact, as I travel, I I was very surprised several years ago to find sushi bars all over the United States. But in turn, I guess my parents, being Iseis, had that could not really pronounce English words, and so that made it sort of a little barrier there. And so, but then in turn, I guess when I travel, and I don't have an English first name, so they think that, oh, I'm from Japan, and so suddenly now when others meet up with me, they're rather surprised at how well I can pronounce some of the English words and speak in English. And in fact, they want some of them would really wonder, well, who is this guy? Well, how is he getting? How does he speak? And so, and then, but again, being a Japanese American going through school, there was a real barrier and the division in many of our activities that went on, and it turns out that we were usually not invited to some of the uh, doings, or say some of the activities that went on with the other kids in school. So I'll end with that.
So Takashi, some of my favorite experiences, one of my favorite experiences on this job is walking through Little Tokyo with you and sort of getting the tour of what it looked like before the war and everything. And so let me ask you, did you notice a change in that community specifically from before the war to the time when you came back after the war?
Well, I guess the the change wasn't that really much going on right after the war.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I remember now is that when I was then released from prison and went to actually came back to Los Angeles, the big change was that we had that smog, but we finally got rid of that anyway. But the stores along East First Street were basically still, in fact, there's still some of the actual stores or the building is still intact. And so you can see, and I can still remember some of the little shops and the different little businesses that were there. And I think at one time they actually put the names of the different proprietors in front of the stores. And so one day somebody pointed out, it says, "Hey, your name is in the sidewalk." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" So I go over and I take a look and I says, "Oh yeah, there's was actually, there was a name for my uncle who ran a general store on East First Street, which is now, I've forgotten the name, or the confectionery store now is operating there." And so I thought, yeah, well, I guess as a youngster, 4 or 5 years old, I was running around right there at that particular spot. So, but then as time went on, I did see the larger, taller buildings, especially like the hotels and some of the businesses, the banks on the corner that changed. So, and then also along Central Avenue, we now have the Japanese National Museum, which is a real nice change for the area. I'll stop with that.
Yeah. And that gives us great segue to jump over and talk to Clement, who, I think it's fair to call a denizen of Little Tokyo as well. Yeah, Clement? At least professionally, that's where you work, and that's a big part of your life and who you are. And so we got to talking about this when we were practicing for this program here. But you were talking a little bit about your earliest exposures to Japanese culture and kind of your upbringing and what it was like. And I wonder if you can dive a little more into that, into, as you were growing up, what was the culture like there in LA?
I think I can very much relate to Shirley. I didn't know about camps, or I didn't know my mother was a hibakusha until I was in college. When I began to learn more about the atomic bomb. But also, it wasn't until 1988 where my father starts looking for records, and I'm thinking, what are you going to do with this record? It's like, oh, it's for redress. You're going to get $20,000 for what? I had no idea, And I went to a school, a Japanese Catholic school. So I was surrounded by people. They may have been talking about camp, but I was probably thinking Boy Scouts. So it's amazing how a lot of the Japanese Americans, maybe it probably is because of trauma, they chose not to burden their children with it. I mean, it used to once I discovered they had gone through this experience, I think that's where the curiosity really set in, and I sought out to learn more about, like, how did this woman who, like, took care of me, fed me when I was sick, just did all these wonderful things, was part of this really traumatic, terrible experience in Japan. And I didn't know that. I felt so, like, out of sync. And I think I mentioned to you earlier, when I was growing up, I was surrounded. That's different than Shirley. I was surrounded by Japanese Americans, like, continually until I went home. Then it was Latinos, but I had almost like, I didn't want to be Japanese. I wanted to be like an American. So it was a very strange feeling growing up. But again, once I started to discover more about this ideal of Japanese American history and culture, I had a greater appreciation of who I was. And really this ideal of cultural democracy, this idea that America is great, not because of 1776 and what they did in the revolution. It was really because of all the contributions of people of color and everybody in making America what it is today. And so that's been sort of my perspective since then. So.
Excellent. Now, jumping a generation down, let's speak to Aaron as a Yonsei there, and what do you hear in there that's familiar to you from Clement and Shirley's experiences, and how have your experiences been different, Aaron?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is when I first learned what the term Yonsei meant, which was at Janum, actually in the gift shop, because they have Generations tea. And I remember looking at it with my dad and like figuring out which I was, and then buying the Yonsei tea. I don't know, sometime in college when I was at Janum for research or something. But anyway, all that aside, I think kind of similarly to Shirley in a lot of ways, I grew up quite removed from any kind of Japanese American community. Not to say that there isn't one in New England or in Connecticut where I grew up, but it just wasn't part of, how we participated in our town. But I think family was really important to us from both sides, from my mom's side and from my dad's side. And so even from a young age, I remember being really curious about all sets of my grandparents. One of my favorite memories is when both sets of grandparents were together for the only time I can remember in my childhood. And it was for my first communion. So it felt like it was about me. And they were just so excited to meet each other, to have like my Irish Catholic grandparents and my Japanese American grandparents greeting each other, and just to see that respect and real mutual love there, I think really has stuck with me. And even though I think as a kid, I had not a real sense of Japanese culture as I was growing up, there are things that now I look back on and say, like, oh, that's where some of that comes from. And that's that food that we ate whenever Grand Grandpa were visiting. Like, that's some of this, as Shirley and Takashi were talking about, that food that informs so much of culture too. But I think as Shirley was talking, I was thinking also about this sort of generational privilege that I have, that, for my dad, I don't know, those conversations between, him and his parents wouldn't have been so easy, I think. Whereas now with this sort of space between me and my grandparents, there are these questions that are maybe easier for me to think about and to ask. Even though both of my grandparents passed away before I was old enough or had these questions, there's still a sense of, wanting to get to know them, and having other uncles and aunties around and other elders through Heart Mountain and through, community gatherings, that I've been able to ask some of these questions, that there's a sense of, wanting to share with a younger generation that maybe doesn't understand and didn't grow up in that context. That for my dad, I think growing up in Gardena in the 50s and 60s wasn't something that he was thinking about or was going to ask his parents. So I'm really grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the ways that, you know, coming out of the redress movement and these sort of days of remembrance, that we have these community memories that are passed around, and days where we're, you know, reflecting on generations and reflecting on resilience, but then also thinking about, like, how do we take this history that shapes our community, and how do we make sure that, you know, we're paying attention to what's happening around us and to other communities and those kinds of things. So I'm very grateful for the way that my relationship with a Japanese American identity and with Japanese culture in the US has evolved with this community and with this sort of desire to think about how the past continues to shape our present in so many ways.
Yeah, and I want to dive back more into that with you, Aaron, here in a little bit, but
Yeah.
I do want to hear from Noriko just a little bit from kind of a different perspective there. You know, as a Nisei and Noriko, you know, the Japanese American culture that these guys have talked about that's been passed down here in the United States. I'm interested how it seems to you. Are there parts of it that, you know, you find familiar to you, or are there parts of it that seem uniquely American to it?
So I come from modern Japan, right? So, and when I came to the United States, first of all, I was really surprised, astonished that because there's 3 surviving Nihon Machi, right, in the US. So of course, Little Tokyo that some of you, and there's the amazing museum, and there's San Jose. So when I'm walking through those towns, everything is, I was just really surprised, and it's preserved. And also talking about food with this theme, I go to like Fugetsudo or the manju shops, and it's very nostalgic. It's different flavor than what I'm used to appreciating in Japan. Because in Japan now, it has all kind of hybrid manju and sweet, and they're bringing the Western flavors into the traditional Japanese flavors. So that was really like, oh, I felt very like happy to try these traditional type of manju. And also when I came as a college student, and I was to major American studies, and I thought I was going to learn about America. And then in one of my senior years, I picked up this book by Professor or Dr. Ronald Takaki, Strangers from the Different Shores. That's when I first learned about the Japanese American experience. So I was like, wow, I didn't know anything about the Japanese American experience, because that was not really taught back when I was a student in Japan. So that just like the curiosity kind of led me to this journey and meeting so many of the the Nisei generation. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to meet that Issei generation, but with the Nisei generation, it's just so amazing to learn from their narratives. And in other words, I have learned what to be Japanese American from the Niseis and the elders because of the value, like the Meiji period. This is in a very positive way. Everything is preserved despite of the war. It's so fascinating because after the war in Japan, like Japan has moved on, right, to catch up with United States and other leading nations. But just that being in the United States, from my personal experience, things were preserved, just like the manju shops, for example, and also the Nihon Machis, and through the Niseis who were brought up by the Issei parents who came from Japan. So I just learned like so much and felt in a way comfortable, because as I stayed longer in the US, because I was also searching for my identity, I came to study like America, but I'm not Caucasian, so I'm not, I'm a little bit different, or use the word unique, right? So if the society is telling me a little bit different, but then the niche was the Japanese Americans has welcomed me, and it was really comfortable, became friends, going picnics and all kinds of things. So yeah, but let me stop there.
Can I ask a question, Noriko? Do you
Yes.
feel like you're Japanese American, or do you feel that you're a Japanese person in America today?
Oh, today, okay. So I think my identity has shifted within the last decade plus, because first, always it was like an international student. So that was kind of my identity, like an outsider. But now that I've been here close to 20 years, I feel I'm more Asian American, Japanese American in my identity. So I feel more comfortable. So when people ask me, I will say I'm Asian American or Japanese American. So, yeah. But I still on that journey, I feel so. Yeah, thank you.
You know, and that's a great question, Shirley, and I'm going to flip that back on you guys as well, because I think that's something that's not necessarily just true of the Issei experience, of like Noriko's experience. You know, Shirley, did you growing up think of yourself in terms of Japanese American being your primary identity, and when did that change and how did that change?
Well, I definitely did not, because there were no other Japanese Americans in Ann Arbor. And as a matter of fact, I had a lot of African American friends as well as white friends. And I was actually a cheerleader. I was actually captain of the cheerleading squad at Ann Arbor Huron High School with School of 2000. And if you look at the photographs, they're all, you know, black and white cheerleaders. And I don't think people kind of knew what to make of me. I mean, I remember one time I had a student ask me if I was black or white. And I remember saying, well, in the summertime, I'm black because my skin gets dark and my mom perms my hair. But I'm a white person during the winter because my hair gets straight and my skin turns a lot whiter. And it's like, it wasn't like even a joke. I mean, it was like, oh, wow, okay. Well, we were trying to figure out who you were, you know, kind of thing. So, you know, I never really felt Japanese American. I knew I was Asian. And I think that when I came to Washington, D.C. and worked as a lawyer and got active in the legal community, and when the minority bars and different lawyers were kind of blossoming in the 90s and early 2000s, in a lot of ways, I felt like I had a lot of external pressure to be Asian. And I remember a Hispanic law student came up to me once and said, why don't you hang around with the other, you know, Asian law students? And I said, you mean the Japanese American law students from Hawaii? I mean, being from the Midwest, I don't know how I could be any different. So big difference of being, you know, a Midwestern Japanese American than, you know, I can't compare myself with how the Hawaiians are, because it's a totally different culture. I mean, at least it was very jarring for me. So I think I'm coming more into my own, I would say now, especially with my work with Heart Mountain. And it's all good. I mean, like, you know, I kind of did things backwards. You know what I mean? I found the culture more as I got older. And in some ways it's sort of sad, but, you know, you can't plan your life out perfectly. You know, it's not my fault I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right? Although I must say that my father had a lot of Japanese doctoral students. And actually, Professor Sugabayashi was one of his students, and they're listening tonight and part of the audience. So that's a nice connection.
So Clement, Takashi, I'm interested in sort of the same question from your perspective, since both of you grew up in communities that had a lot more Japanese Americans in them there. You know, has the way that you thought about yourself as a Japanese American changed over the course of your lives?
No, I think basically, yeah, Japanese American. One of the things that really, I guess, tied me in more to the Japanese culture was that they had a Japanese language school. And so after our regular English school, which then at that time would be ending at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we then turned around and we may have gone home, but then in turn, we then ended up at our Japanese school, which was just a couple blocks away from where I lived. And so I spent every weekday, Mondays through Friday, from about 3 o'clock to about 5 o'clock in the Japanese school, learning the Japanese language, although I wasn't a very good student at that. So there was this tie-in there. But in turn, one of the other things I felt very strange was as I was in grammar school, I was in the class of say 30 kids, and there was a mix of Japanese, we had blacks, we had Filipinos, and I don't think we had any Chinese, and we had the Latinos and the whites all mixed into a class of say 30 kids. But then when we went from grammar school into junior high school, I suddenly found myself as the only Japanese in all my different classes that I took. And so I was actually then separated out. And then that also occurred as I went into high school. And so I sort of drifted away from the well, we had then other activities that I would always go back and associate with the other Niseis. But then that was sort of a strange thing that happened to me. And I sort of had this little different environment as I was going through the school. So, but then, once you're in college, well, I had a complete mix there. So, but then even in college, I guess with my workload, study load, I seldom had time to really join with some of the Nisei clubs, so that in a way, I was a little away from the Japanese group socially, but then still yet we had different festivities and so forth, and then we had different activities at the Japanese language schools, which then really tied me back into the Japanese American Society. So basically, yes, I considered myself as a Japanese American, and had friends all the way, from the white group to the blacks, even some Latino friends. So I had a broad group of people, of kids that I really grew up with, and also learned how to understand some of the ways that the different ethnic groups were speaking. And it was kind of interesting. And someone said, well, "What's that guy saying?" I said, "Well, having grown up with this mixed group, I said, oh, he's saying this and that," which which sort of helped me out. So I'll finish that. Yeah.
That's really cool. I think that's one of the interesting things about the Nisei upbringing that we don't get into, is how multicultural some of these neighborhoods were, and how you were used to a mix of kids in there. It wasn't homogenous at all. Clement, what's that look like many years later when you're growing up?
Again, I totally relate to all. I feel like our identities are just constantly evolving. And like I mentioned, when I was in kindergarten, it was a Japanese American school, or just Japanese school, St. Francis. And, there was a Christian Catholic missionary. Our were nuns. And so I already knew I was part of this community, but when I would go home, I would live in East LA, so it was mostly Latino. So I also felt this sort of difference in communities. And I always think of the phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." And so as I got older and older, I realized, Latinos suffered a lot of discrimination and prejudice as well. And so there was this kind of bond that would continue to evolve. And coming to the museum, getting to meet people like Tak and 100 other Nisei volunteers really helped to, just looking at this panel, I feel a great sense of pride being Japanese American, because of all the incredible things that I've learned from, not just things, but like personality, like traits, hard work, honesty, friendship, trust. I've just felt like I've grown so much. I look at Aaron and I see the future, and there's just so many good things that to me Japanese American represents. And I relate that to being Asian American, and I also relate that to Latino struggles, Black struggles, because the one thing unique about not the unique thing, but the Japanese American experience has is this event of incarceration that really allows us to become spokespeople for what can happen if democracy fails, and how it's important that that be translated to other ethnic groups and everybody, because it is we've seen how fragile it is, and it's important that we continue to share this story. So yeah, Japanese American is a great. I look at it with great pride for myself.
Clement, that actually brings me to my next question. I would want to talk a little bit about, current events and what's going on today. And, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a real resurgence in violence and discrimination against Asian Americans. And so I wanted to ask all of you, first off, have you felt more othered, more visible and looked upon with perhaps suspicion since the pandemic has come out there? But also, do you feel like this has impacted newer immigrants from Asian countries in ways that, seem at least historically similar to you as Japanese Americans? And Erin, we haven't heard from you in a little bit, so I'll jump in with you with that.
I knew that was going to happen. Yeah, thanks for that question, Dakota. It's a good one, and it's obviously a complex one. I think the first thing that comes to mind when you're asking this is first, like, well, I haven't gone outside very much, so that has definitely kept me safe. But jokes aside, I also know that I often can be very white passing, and there's a certain privilege that comes along with being mixed race and being half white, half Irish, I always say. And so that's something that I think I've been thinking about a lot for a long time. I think I grew up maybe not identifying as Japanese American so much as half Japanese until later on, and until I really started learning about histories of Japanese America. But that now it's thinking about like, okay, what is this sort of privilege that I have that's very real, that very much keeps me safe and keeps my siblings safe? And then what's the sort of responsibility that comes along with this, with understanding the history behind a lot of this prejudice and racism, but then also, having a foot in the other world and being able to have tough conversations with folks or just call things out as I see them from this sort of place of privilege. So I think that's been a good many moments of reckoning over the past several months. And I feel very lucky to be also surrounded by a community of grad students, but other folks where I am who are thinking critically about this too, and trying to reach across community lines to have some of these conversations. I think thinking about this sort of violence and resurgence, if we want to call it that, of racism and prejudice is similar to the histories of Japanese American incarceration, in that Asians in the US have always been sort of racialized as perpetual foreigners. No matter when you came to the US, which ancestors came to the US, how good your English is, all of that, I think there's this sort of inherent foreignness that is part of the structures of white supremacy and settler colonialism that sort of shape the United States and shape the history of the United States. So I think there is a sort of interesting and important conversation to be had across communities and across generations of Asians in the United States, Asian Americans, Southeast Asians. I think there's often a sort of privilege accorded to East Asians, especially when we think about, the model minority thesis and myth that was accorded Japanese Americans and all of that. So I think definitely that, there are moments of similarity. There are threads that we can pull across the fabric of history. That's part of, I think, why studying history is so important, is to see where these pieces come from. But then I think also being cognizant of the fact that we're living in a very specific moment when we're thinking about race in the United States. And so how can we have these conversations in a way that moves us out of, this is just how it is, or this is just what happens when you move to this country, and say like, well, actually, how do we change that and how do we make it better? Yeah, I'll stop there.
And Noriko, I can be interested in you chiming in, because I know that this is something that the Smithsonian and the National American Museum of History, that you guys have been thinking a lot about over the course of this year, is sort of these historical trends in America and sort of these structural problems that we've got that allow this sort of racism to rear its ugly head in the face of crisis. And so Tell me a little more about what you at the Smithsonian have been working on.
So thank you, Dakota. So we've been, there's a team of curators, researchers collecting on this, trying to preserve this narrative on COVID-19 and also the frontline essential workers. And also, as I think we are very familiar, just last month, what was happening at the Capitol grounds. So I think there's a team also are trying to preserve that narrative as well, because this is all current and also what's happening in the nation's capital and also across the United States. So we are trying to tell the narrative, and also from the Black Lives Matters movement, hope when the COVID is settled, that hope you guys can come visit. There's an amazing area called the Black Lives Matter area, just close, not too far from the White House. So there were amazing events taking place, and there were Asian Pacific American groups that were coming out there. I think like Tsuru for Solidarity were out there, and there were so many just people coming together, not just the APA community, but I think just coming together. And I think it makes it like partnering. I think Heart Mountain is very good at reaching out to the different groups, because we become so silo with, we're doing amazing work, right? Each of us in our own community, but sometimes we're not necessarily talking to each other. So I think if we come together, it becomes a very powerful movement and share each other's resource. So that's happening. And also, if I may put a plug, since this is the Day of Remembrance. So tomorrow is the actual Day of Remembrance when FDR signed Executive Order 9066. So we are hosting an event on the Day of Remembrance on the day of 19. And it's called The Facism. And we're featuring David Ono, who is the ABC anchor person. And he has this amazing series called Facism. And we're selecting 2 episodes to discuss, and history of the accountability and tying into the Japanese American experience. And one is about the COVID-19 narrative. So that's going to be an amazing conversation. And we'll have 2 fellows, a younger voice. We wanted to hear from younger Asian Pacific American participants. And we'll also have Anne from the Japanese American National Museum to share her comment. So, so we're gonna really talk about this. And I think one of it is to having a dialogue. It's actually not to ignore this, but to talking about this is a start, I think, yeah. So sorry, if I may say one more thing. I think Japanese audience, I guess the Josai college students are tuning in. I hope, because when I came as an international student to the United States, this was like all foreign. So I hope by reaching out and partnering with the Japanese audience, and I think Dakota, you mentioned the Japanese government has been helping with this effort. So I think I wish that we can tie the partnership and grow, because that's one way. And maybe more of the students, either if they're in Japan or in the United States temporary, that might change and help grow and understand the Japanese American experience. It's not like too foreign to them, like, oh, I have nothing to do with it. But it really matters when you're in the United States. If you're studying here, or if you're a business person for temporary, or if you're a diplomat. So I think that will help to understand each other and where we're coming from. So thanks.
Thanks, Sarika. So talking about the role of institutions gives me to something that I wanted to talk with you about, Clement, which is sort of the artistic tradition within the Japanese American community. Because interestingly to me, this is one thing that, while other aspects of Japanese American life were sort of being actively suppressed by the government when they sent the Japanese Americans to the camps, and even before and after, for that matter. You know, the arts is one thing that surprisingly was able to kind of thrive in its way within the camps. And so I'm interested to get your take on it as an artist and as a curator, Clement, on, you know, why that artistic tradition was able to thrive within this environment, and how that continues on today, and what the arts in the Japanese American community looks like in the present.
Can I share my screen?
Yes, absolutely. Hold on, let me give you permission.
Just really quick, not
I mean, permission on the program. I obviously give you permission. There you go. You should be able to now.
So I think it's clear that in spite of America's concentration camps, Japanese American creativity thrived. And so this is just one picture of a camp for those people in Japan, maybe not familiar with the camp. This is a picture of Tule Lake concentration camp. So all Japanese Americans on the West Coast were incarcerated. If you can imagine that, every single person, even if they were sick, elderly, orphans, were incarcerated. This camp was later turned into a segregation camp, and at its peak, it had over 18,000 people. So that you could let that sink in for a little bit. But the project that I've been working on is about arts and crafts. And thanks to Shirley, Higuchi, and the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, the museum is the beneficiary of all of their incredible work. If you want to know more about it, go to the website, because Shirley and I could talk about this for hours. but just know that the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation was instrumental with their legal battle with the Allen Hendershot Eaton Foundation. But I'm just showing this because the pandemic hit, and we've been able to use this time to do some research. So I think my brother is also watching too. So my brother is a Japanese literature scholar. And so I've asked him to help us do a lot of work. So he's been able to look at some of these photographs. And so this is an example of the Issei. So we know the Issei did senryu, or poetry, in camp. So in spite of first having to sell all your property, get rid of everything, you know, selling it for pennies on the dollar, or maybe not even pennies, maybe just destroying it because you can't bear to give it to someone else for nothing. So you destroy it. And then you go to camp. And then in camp, they ask you, are you loyal to America? Or are you willing to forswear any allegiance to Japan? The loyalty questionnaires. And so those Japanese, if they said no to any one of them, or if they were suspect, they would have been segregated and sent to Tule Lake. So this is a work that was created in 1945, Showa 20. All the translations, my brother. So Leo Hanawi, thank you, Leo, for all your translations. But it just shows you how, in spite of all of these things, you know, they still had a connection to who they were. And in spite of the harsh conditions, the lack of material, they had no store to buy these things from. They had to take only what they could carry. And so a few of them who were, you know, Japanese might have brought a brush or some ink or some paper, because in their minds, this is what would keep them going, is the peace of mind, the sort of serenity that nature and creativity can provide them in any situation. So this is just so if we look at the description here, it says that this is a collection of autographs from the Ikata Club. This is what Allen Hendershot Eaton wrote. And so this is sort of what you would get if a Western European interpreted your work. But so this is some of the translations that my brother had done for me. And so if you look at it, it's just interesting to kind of read. These were more than signatures. They were actual poems, senryu. So senryu is different than haiku in that haiku is more about nature and natural phenomena, where senryu is more about psychological like Seinfeld. You know, it's much more about real life and sort of the things that you have in life that are either frustrate you or they. And so this is what some of these Iseis were thinking. These would have probably been Meiji period, first generation Japanese. I believe in the land of the gods and live for the hope of tomorrow. So it's an example of how maybe religion helped people to sort of persevere, but also their poetry, their creativity. Okay, here's another one. I stare at my shadow and walk. I've grown tired of the fence. So it's a direct reference to being in camp. I mean, this person would have probably been in one camp, would have to be transferred into this camp because he was, you know, deemed unloyal. And he's talking about sort of, I mean, just the poetry, if you kind of look into it, it's kind of like he's staring at his shadow, which is really nothing. It's kind of like an empty ghost of themselves. And all they're doing is walking around a fence. You know, just if you look at the first picture of the Tulile camp, you know, that's an interesting camp because if you looked very closely, it was hard to see, but there was about 28 guard towers that surrounded that entire camp. And there was a stockade. There was a prison within a prison for people that they felt were too radical. So it's just interesting to have this kind of expression by an Issei inside camp. And then this is just one more translation. Before I knew it, I've raised the child of a person of the enemy state. And so Senju is interesting because it's really about the psychology of sort of the situation that you're in and sort of the kind of, there's a little bit of futility here, but also acceptance and the irony of that your children might be part of this enemy state. So, I mean, and I just share this because to me, it kind of goes to Dakota's question, you know, this ideal of like, how did creativity thrive in the camp? And, you know, it was a place where there was more free time and there was a lot of industrious Japanese people. Even in the assembly centers, we know that Obata had created the Tanforan art school, you know, to begin engaging people to express themselves in positive ways in spite of this terrible thing, you know. And so I think the arts, you know, they made this Eaton collection that, you know, Shirley helped the museum to get was, it's full of crafts. It's full of wood crafts, shell crafts, paintings, just everything imaginable. You know, those ikebana. There was vases that were made. There was calligraphy, lots of calligraphy. So and to me, that's just an example of, again, it was their way of maintaining an appreciation of who they were, their lives, but also being very positive, because I think it was hard for this generation of people to like fight. Like people often ask, why didn't you fight? I think it was a different America. I think racism was rampant. I mean, who would have thought you would have been able to take 120,000 people and put them in the camp? It was because a few years earlier, about 500,000 Mexicans were sent back to Mexico with Mexican repatriation. I mean, America was it's still a racist country, but it was even more racist back then. So it's just, you know, it's a much different world. So.
That was beautiful, Clement. Thanks for sharing that. Especially, it was probably very interesting to our Japanese students and the professors in Japan that are tuning in. But, you know, you so eloquently really discuss how important the arts were, and even food. Food was very important to the incarcerated. That's the reason why at Heart Mountain they began growing their own vegetables. But this is actually in my book. My grandmother Higuchi actually made this in camp for her daughter, Emily, who was 5 at the time. And she used, you know, basically a zipper from a pair of pants and an old dress, and she knitted the outside. But in my book, I talk about one of the first things she took with her, my grandmother Higuchi, was a pair of sewing scissors. And she knew that instinctively she would need to make clothing in the camp. And she hid the scissors in my Aunt Emily's head of the doll. She took the doll out and put the scissors in. And that's how the scissors got into the camp. So, you know, I'm the beneficiary of a lot of the work that she had done in the camp. And I have this beautiful purse as well as other things.
Shirley, once again, you provided me a great transition. But before we move on, I would be remiss if I did not mention that in reference to what Clement was talking about, that part of this project we're working on with the Japanese embassy in the United States, they are making it possible for the first time to translate the literary journals, the Heart Mountain Bunge. For the first time, we're going to see a lot of this poetry, a lot of these essays that are coming from the Nisei that are their reflections from within the camp on the camp experience itself. And so here this spring, those are going to be going up on our website. And we're kicking off with a couple of issues and hoping to continue that onward. So I would definitely encourage people to keep on the lookout for that, because that's going to be great. But I think Shirley brought me back to something that I had wanted to ask you about, that we've spoken about in kind of abstract terms. You know, we've talked about what makes you guys feel pride in being a Japanese American. We've talked about some of the traditions and the food specifically that brings you joy there. And I want to delve a little deeper into it. I want you guys to describe for me a little bit, you know, what are these traditions? What are the holidays? What are the festivities? What are the foods that really make you you know, feel that joy about your identity there? And Takashi, let's kick things off with you.
Well, that's kind of, I worked in the mess hall, so I'm coming from the other side. But well, just one little incident, just to talk about the food. They shipped in barrels of frozen, I think it was herring, salted herring. And so when they first arrived, the cooks then tried to make it, cooked it up and served it to the people. And I remember I working as a busboy. And so as the people left the mess hall, the people just couldn't eat that particular salted herring, and it was just terrible. So, you know, just a lot of waste. And so the cooks then, I guess they sort of scratched their heads and says, well, we got to do something because we got a lot of this stuff, this herring coming in. And so then I remember we were then set to, they said, okay. And then we had the old hand grinding, I guess, hamburger type of machine. And so we took the salted herring and ground the whole thing up, you know, the heads, fins, the guts and everything. And I said, don't you want to take the gut? No, just grind the whole thing up. Okay. So we ground it up. But then what the cooks did, and I don't know the Japanese word for it, but they made a paste from the herring and made it into little cakes. And then they fried it in deep fat. And that was a sort of a traditional Japanese type of fish presentation. And so when they did that, then again, as a busboy watching the people come out and cleaning the dishes were all clean. So I stopped with that. Yeah. So anyway, so that was a change now where the cooks turned around and made, when they actually delved into it and made it something that was very a traditional type of food. Yeah.
Shirley, you've talked about how even though you were kind of isolated as a Japanese American family by yourselves there, that you still kept up some of those traditions. Tell me a little about what you remember of those.
Well, I remember when I was at college at University of Michigan Ann Arbor, my Aunt Kathy had actually came from California to visit. So she packed all the sashimi, the fresh sashimi on ice and brought it. And that was probably, God, I'm trying to figure out when that might have been, like 19, maybe it was 80 or 79 or 78. And I didn't really like raw fish, like when I first tried it, but it really grows on you. And as a matter of fact, I was so inspired by this panel. I think I'm actually going to do carry out sushi tonight. I mean, it made me hungry just listening to everybody talk. So, it's really the food. My grandmother Higuchi was actually in Washington, D.C., and she would make the fudamaki and the various kind of maki rolls. And she even made the sprouts. She grew sprouts in her basement. I mean, she really strived to really bring Japan to us as the grandchildren. And I think that had a really major impact. I think the other thing that I think Clement sort of touched on this, that I think has given a lot of the Sance and the Yonsei a lot of strength, is just sort of the character and the strength that the Issei community really had coming from Japan. And I kind of marveled at the stories of my own grandparents and how brave and industrious they were to come to a foreign country not speaking English. I studied Takashi's father, who seemed really really intelligent and level-headed in terms of how he probably taught Takashi and his brother to think about the future. But it's just this really strong sense of stability and even-handedness that, most you would think that, if we were in that situation, I was in that situation, I probably would have really not come out of it as well as a lot of the Issei and Nisei. And I think that we, Sansei and Yonsei and other generations marvel at that strength. And I think that's what carries me forward. And I'm sure it carries all of us forward.
And that's a great thought, Shirley. And, it does remind me that so much of what we think of as culture, we think of, the food and the trappings and everything, but there's a lot of culture that's invisible. It's values, it's ideals, And I guess a question for you guys is how do you feel that has been passed on to you within the Japanese American community? What are those values? What are those ideals? And furthermore, going further than that, how are you passing them on to your own kids, those of you who have kids? And Clement, I know that group includes you, so why don't we start with you there?
How do I pass them on?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think like Noriko had mentioned earlier, she was talking about these feelings that she gets. I think we use the word natsukashi all the time. There's so many of these words that are sort of imbued in our life that don't have a exact English equivalent. And so you only communicate it in Japanese. And I think natsukashi is a really good word because a lot of these things, like whether it's obon foods or traditional arts that you might see, or the things that you want your kids to appreciate from your life, or all go back to our parents or their grandparents. And it is this warm feeling in your heart of natsukashi that you want to ensure lives on for all of your other children. So we slowly teach, my kids. One of my kids is 30, so it's not. They hopefully they already have it, but yeah, I have one that's 9, and so we teach him. We teach him some bad words too, like baka or something, but we also want to ensure that he has the good words because it is the nomenclature or the vernacular of the Japanese. Like gaman is a good word to explain the past, but I don't like to use it I don't want my son to have gaman. I want him to go out and fight because that's why our Issei parents, like Shirley said, gamanned, so that we wouldn't have to, so that we could go out and we could do the work of justice and equality. So,
and explain that just for some of our viewers who might be outsiders that are unfamiliar with the concept of gaman.
Well, I mean, so there's a lot of words like shikata ga nai or kodomo no tameni, or gaman is this sense that you will just endure. You will take this pain and suffering and you will rise above it, and you won't let them take you down. You'll survive. But I don't think it's a healthy thing. I think it's like Shirley said, you marvel at how much they took, how much they were able to endure, and then provide for their children later on. That's suffering. And then when you realize it, that's where, again, where we started with the discovery thing, like, my goodness, I want to know so much about my parents. They were so gaman,
And I think part of the Japanese culture that may have carried over from Japan, it's like in my family, and I see other Japanese American families, they put their children first, which in some ways in America, that's a foreign concept. I mean, like really putting your children first, wanting your children to have a better life than you, and making sure that they do have a better life. I mean, I know with, even my parents, when I went to law school in DC at Georgetown, they wanted to make sure I had the best car possible. So I got the top of the line Honda Accord, and I was like, wow, like I've got this really great car. But it's like my parents wanted to make sure that if I was going to go to DC, that I would have a really good car with air conditioning. And I think that's really putting your kids first. When I look at other Caucasian families, they always give them hand-me-downs, like, the old car that grandpa didn't want that barely runs, and then they charge him for it. You know what I mean? And I think it's just different in the Japanese American culture. They really want their children to be better than they were. And I don't know if I'm alone in that perspective. So I open it up to Aaron and others.
Well, I think that is very true, because that was one of the things that sort of went through the total community. It's always, and for the children, kodomo no tame, it's for the children. Yeah, very true.
And I think as someone who doesn't have kids yet, but is very much the beneficiary of so much of this that we've been talking about, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, that's sort of an inheritance of sorts, or something that I think I really attribute to my grandparents and to my parents, is this sense of humility that comes along with being Japanese American, because there are so many pieces of my own past and my own family's history that I will never be able to know. There's a certain sense of, needing to come to terms with those silences, learn as much as I can, but also just know that I'm never going to know everything, and that that's okay, and that that's a way to approach other histories, other folks within the Japanese American community, and especially with outside of it, to approach this way of sort of wanting to learn about other communities' experiences, other families' experiences, and having this sense of, we're all trying to figure it out, as we were talking about with our identities before. It's a constantly evolving process. And I think as a historian, or as a historian in training, that's been a really important lesson for me, this sort of humility and curiosity and compassion, and this knowledge that, we can't go back and ask our ancestors these questions, that needs to be part of the story too, and that's okay. And I think a lot of just respect for my grandparents, and for the ways that they did what they needed to do. And I can't fault them for not, I can't be upset with my grandmother for not talking about these stories or sharing them. And that's just been an important, I think, way for me to approach my work, and also just how I want to move through the world too.
So we've got time for one more question before we move over to many of our audience questions. We've got some good ones coming in through the chat here. But before we move over to that, I want to ask a big picture question. And that is sort of looking at the community today, and not just the Japanese American community, but the Nikkei community worldwide, the Japanese diaspora throughout the globe. And it's starting to shift, for one, as Aaron kind of alluded to, it's becoming more multiracial. But another way is that people are starting to connect. One of the great things that I saw out of the virtual pilgrimage last summer was how many Nikkei from far-flung corners of the globe were talking to each other and engaging with one another. And not with just others in other countries, but also with Japan too. Much more engagement there that, again, we're seeing through Josiah International University participating today. So I've got a question for each of you, and we'll start with Takashi, having the longest view as our resident elder here. How do you envision the future of Japanese America and of Japanese American identity? What does that look like to you?
Well, that kind of goes, well, one of the things that, like in our family, I think, you can't get the exact number, but most of my siblings have married Caucasians. And so again, I see the Japanese American population sort of assimilating away. and and so and hopefully as that happens, that a lot of the traditions, the I guess the teachings will continue on. And even though the Japanese, I'll say the Japanese blood itself is will be thinning out. In fact, I must say that my wife was Chinese, so that created a real problem right after World War II. But again, uh, there's this dispersal that's going on, and also hopefully that as each of the uh, Japanese Americans strive to do better, that they in turn will add to the total of the United States. And also, I think right now with this racism sort of underlying, and hopefully that we can actually disperse that. But then that again will take, again, hopefully that the Japanese Americans us having gone through all of that will sort of help other groups to assimilate or to help in their particular problems.
And Noriko, I would be interested in your perspective next, as somebody who comes through it from, you know, both a Japanese perspective and an American perspective.
Yes. So part of me, I think is, I hope is that we don't have to explain each time that we're like we're moved away from a hyphenated American. That, because I think one of us, or I think many of us get this, like, where are you from? Like, where are you really from? That's like an ongoing conversation. So hopefully that in the future that we don't have to like justify or explain ourselves, and it becomes more a how do I say? Well, one thing is with all these interracial marriage too. That's one thing too. I mean, a lot of the Sance generation start marrying out, but it's just that being who we are, and also coming from if it's either from somebody immigrating to South America, because when Japanese couldn't immigrate to the North America, they seek for other opportunities, especially after 1924 to South America, like Brazil, Sao Paulo. So hopefully that becomes like more of the norm, or the new Nikkei, but still feel very proud to be Japanese American descent. And because I know there's a term like happa, right? But my scholar colleague was telling me, oh, I'm double of this, because it's hard to tell. Like, I am half Japanese and I'm half Irish or Chinese American. So like I'm double of each, or whatever your maybe physical or attributes are, is you're double of everything, right? So hopefully that can be adopted into. And I think one other thing I wanted to point out is when you're talking about like Nikkei, it seems like very North America centric. So maybe, of course, being American, right? You're like America first. But by through these, using this COVID, this new norm as a new platform, so we can have more engagement with outside of North America and really see like what their experience is like, and then have more partnership and to see where the Nikkei is going in the future. So I hope those kind of conversation comes out, because looking something positive into this new norm, maybe because that was, as Dakota was saying, that like the Tadaima, the virtual, was it like Aaron was really helping, was forefront and doing this 9-week virtual pilgrimage, right? That's like amazing. Like, how did you put that together? But that kind of keep going with it, with that momentum. So yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Clement, do you want to speak to that same question just a little bit?
I was so engaged listening to them.
I know some fantastic answers there, but yeah, what's your vision of the future for Japanese American identity?
I mean, I feel like in 2050, hope, will this question be gone? I think to some degree it will, but it's not it's a long throw. It's going to be a long time before this issue completely disappears. So I feel like the museum, well, regardless, preserving this story from a first person perspective is imperative. So our work, your work, Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, Manzanar, all of these locations, all of their work is vital and important because it needs to be told from a first person perspective, first of all. But it's a lesson that will carry on even if you're mixtures of 5 different ethnicities. That 2% that might be Japanese American will feel a connection to that experience and that story. And so I feel like it is truly an American story, a struggle of participation in what they think is an American democracy, but then they get it ripped out of them, and then they struggle and they fight and they're determined to prove that they are American in every sense of the word. So I feel like it'll continue. I think people will still say they're Japanese American too.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think all of those answers have been wonderful. And I think, Clement, going off of what you were just saying about this being an American story, I think is really important to think about. That as much as, Heart Mountain is so important to me and close to my heart as a crucial piece of my Japanese American identity, so much of what brought me to the work I'm doing right now in my doctoral program is thinking about like, well, wait, why didn't I learn about this? Like, why did I learn about the American Revolution 5 times, but I never got to learn about the place where my family was incarcerated during World War II? So trying to think about, the work that Janum, that Heart Mountain, that all of these wonderful places, the Smithsonian, are doing to preserve this history and bring other folks in, I think is really important. So I'm excited to see that continuing as the Nikkei kind of global community changes. And a huge shout out to Kimiko Mar and Hanako Wakatsuki for pulling together Tadaima over the summer, which all of you were involved in a lot of ways. And I think I would just end by saying that I have been, this is not exactly your question, Dakota, but I've been so inspired by the activism that has emerged the last couple of years that is really, a continuation of decades of Japanese American activism, but standing up, in particular right now for things like HR 40 and trying to think critically about how the Japanese American redress movement can be useful to the movement for Black reparations right now, what our responsibility is as a community to stand up for other groups. I know Tsuru for Solidarity was mentioned earlier, but I think that gives me so much hope right now and is my hope for the future to see the way that the Japanese American community, as it's evolving and growing, is also looking outwards and thinking about how we can bring folks into, our histories, but then also use our history as a platform to speak up for other folks. That's been really inspiring, and I'm excited to see it continue to grow.
Yeah, I think that's been an amazing part of this is for somebody who works in this history to see it be so relevant and so useful. I think that's what your greatest hope is that people can not just learn from history, but use it to make a better future. And so that's been really great. Shirley, I'm going to give you the final word on this question.
Well, the other thing I just realized too was that the other Japanese values that our families probably all inherited is the emphasis on education. Education is really important, and that was really passed down to my kids and so on and so forth. It was always a priority. I think for the future, I think what all the panelists said is correct. I think we need to continue to write books. We need to continue to support the museums. We have to record these firsthand stories. We really have to define this American story and use it, as Erin had suggested, as a learning tool for other disenfranchised communities, whether it's Black Lives Matter or if it's the way that family detention and separation is occurring at the border today. So what we could do with our history is to use it for improving today's society, which is, I think, all of us are doing. And we're doing that through the Japanese American confinement sites advocacy work that many of us are doing together as a team. Another, I think, is a really great market entry for the Japanese Americans is really collaborating with the Japanese government and with Japanese universities like Josai International University. I think it's a win-win where the Japanese learn what the Issei, their kinsmen, what they experienced, and they could learn and connect to the United States to grow interest in Japan. And then we have a connection back to the cultural values that we just articulated around art, food, music, and creative endeavors that I think retain our Japanese origin, but allow us to expand in the United States in a way to continue to share our history. So I think the collaboration with the Japanese is really, really important for cultural preservation issues.
Yeah, very good.
And, you know, all of this talk, it brings me to a group that I did want to give a shout out to today that's doing some important work right now, which is the Campaign for Justice, which is actually in the process of seeking redress for Japanese Latin Americans who were incarcerated by the US government and in many cases, you know, forcibly sent back to Japan in prisoner exchanges there. And they never have really received any redress or any apology from the government as the Japanese Americans did. And so there's a group that's actively trying to make that happen with the Campaign for Justice. I'm going to have Julie drop the link into the chat there. But if you watch the Heart Mountain social media, we're also going to be showing a short video from them tomorrow that's got a little bit of an update on their work. And I definitely encourage everybody to learn a little bit more about that campaign. I think it ties into a lot of the threads that you guys have been talking about just now. We do have some time for some audience questions here. And so I'm going to pull a few out right here. First one is for you, Takashi. We had a question as to whether your parents were allowed to purchase land, and also when you returned after the war, what was Los Angeles like to you? What was the climate? How was it?
Well, the thing was that, as I said, the Isseis were not permitted to buy land because, number one, they were not U.S. citizens. But then one step more, they could not become United States citizens. So what happened in our family was that to purchase a property, my dad then turned to a friend who had a child who was of legal age and was a U.S. citizen. And so the property then was in turn bought under that person's name. And that was one way of getting around so that the Isseis can purchase land. In fact, I went even to the extreme of when a baby was born in the United States, that baby is a U.S. citizen. And so I remember some of the other people then bought the land in the name of this young child who was just a few months old. And it went to the point where I guess the whites objected to that. They went into court, and the court ruled in favor, saying yes, that young child is a U.S. citizen, so therefore there's nothing wrong with that young citizen holding land. So that was the way they did that. And in our case, my dad's business was a grocery store handling mostly Japanese food. And in fact, he did quite well, such to the point that within 5 years, he was able to purchase a property and then actually build a house to house all of our 6 kids. And so he did very well. And then all of this now comes with the movement. He had then to close the business virtually, and I don't think I don't remember exactly how, but he closed the business. He lost the business, and then but the property the house that we had lived in, very fortunately, my dad instead of selling it, turned around and he leased it to the school principal, which was just across the street. And so the school principal was able to live there during the war, and the rent was low enough, just enough to cover the property taxes that had to be paid. And so we had our house or home to come back to after the family left the camp. But in turn, now my dad well, actually, he graduated out in business out of Waseda University. So he had a very good understanding of running a business. And so he, in turn, now couldn't reopen the grocery store. So he then found a plant nursery, rather rundown plant nursery, I guess due to the fact that the war was on. And then we then worked again, worked around getting uh, family, friends with with the children with citizens, and use their name to then start the business. And so that worked out very well. So
Yeah, and that story is in my book, Setsuko's Secret, on page 21. It talks about the evolution of the Hoshizaki family. Yeah, that's a really interesting story. That's when I was saying that Tak's father was really smart. I mean, he was a smart guy. I mean, he graduated from college and he was smart enough to know, to develop the relationship to lease back his property to the family so he was able to keep it, which was really a brilliant strategy. So that was really lucky for you, Takashi.
yeah, thank you. Mhm.
Noriko, I'm going to put this next one to you because it ties into what you were saying about sort of thinking globally here. We had a question come in that from one of our students in Japan there. They were asking, what do you think is the most significant message that it's important to relay on a day of remembrance as we have coming up to not just the Japanese American community in the United States, but the folks back in Japan and the global community as a whole? What's important to remember when we talk about remembrance?
I would say, despite you have the personal history or not, it's this is a human narrative. It's a human story that when you are protected by the U.S. Constitution by law, but when the war happens, or when you're in that situation, that those rights will be removed from you. So when fear takes over in this case, a nation, that everything kind of cancels out. So to remember that narrative, that it could, I hope not, but not to happen to anybody. But this is also a human nature, unfortunately. So, but to remember these narrative, a personal story, and I think even as we're talking about the Day of Remembrance, everybody has a different connection to if it's a Higuchi family versus another Hanami family. So just taking that, remembering it as a human story to talk about, I think that's what I That's what I feel, and the importance of passing it on and commemorating this day. Because otherwise, if we do not commemorate this day, then it will be forgotten. The importance of telling this and sharing it with the community wherever you are. Otherwise, it will be forgotten. Or people like Shirley to write a book. Otherwise, it will be erased from the history or the map, right? So that's what I feel. Thank you
so much. All right, we're coming to the end of our time, everybody. And as much as I'd love to keep asking you guys questions, I think we should probably leave them wanting more. I do want to take one more moment to thank all of our partners this evening, the Japanese American National Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, our friends over at Nisei International University, and especially the Japanese Embassy in the United States who made this whole program possible. We've got lots more exciting programs coming up. And not just from us, as you've been following the links, you'll see there's a bunch of programming happening this weekend that I definitely want to encourage everyone to check out. So thank you very much to all of our panelists, and thank everyone for tuning in. Good night.
Goodbye.